Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she bent down to collect the empty brass casings scattered across the concrete floor. The afternoon sun blazed through the windows of the riverside shooting range, casting long shadows between the shooting lanes. She had been working at the facility for 3 years now, ever since her divorce left her scrambling to find steady income to support her 8-year-old daughter, Emma. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Every day, she arrived at 6 in the morning to prepare the range for customers, cleaned the lanes between sessions, and stayed until closing to ensure everything was secure. The work was repetitive and often lonely, but Sarah found a strange peace in the methodical nature of her tasks. The smell of gunpowder had become familiar, almost comforting, and she had learned to distinguish between different calibers just by the sound of their reports. Today had been particularly busy. A group of off-duty police officers had spent the morning practicing their qualification courses, followed by several recreational shooters who came in during their lunch breaks. The range had only been quiet for the past hour, giving Sarah time to catch up on cleaning and maintenance. She moved systematically down lane 12, picking up the spent cartridges and dropping them into her collection bucket. The brass clinked together with each addition, creating a metallic rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her workdays. As she worked, her mind wandered to Emma, who would be getting out of school in 2 hours. Sarah had promised to take her to the park afterward, something she tried to do at least twice a week to make up for the long hours her job demanded. The range owner, Mr., had been understanding about her situation. He was a former Marine in his 60s who had opened the facility after retiring from military service. He treated Sarah fairly and even allowed her to bring Emma by occasionally during slow periods, teaching the young girl about firearm safety and responsibility. Sarah appreciated his mentorship, especially since Emma's father had disappeared from their lives completely after the divorce. As Sarah finished collecting the brass from lane 12 and moved to lane 11, she heard the distant sound of vehicles pulling into the parking lot. She glanced at her watch and frowned slightly. It was unusual for customers to arrive this late in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Most of their regular clients came in during specific windows throughout the week, and she had memorized their patterns over the years. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the building, followed by muffled voices. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but something about the tone made her pause. There was an urgency to the conversation that seemed different from the casual chatter of typical customers. She straightened up, listening more carefully as footsteps approached the front entrance. The door chimed as it opened, and Sarah heard Mr.'s voice from the front desk. "Good afternoon. How can I help you today?" His tone was professional but carried a slight edge that Sarah had learned to recognize. After years in the Marines, had developed an instinct for reading people, and that instinct was clearly being triggered now. Sarah continued her cleaning, but she moved closer to the entrance of the shooting bays so she could hear the conversation more clearly. The responding voices were crisp and professional, but she couldn't distinguish individual words over the ambient noise of the building's ventilation system. Something about the exchange made her feel uneasy, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Minutes passed, and the conversation at the front desk continued. Sarah had finished collecting brass from 3 more lanes when she heard footsteps entering the main shooting area. She looked up to see 3 men in civilian clothing walking through the entrance. They moved with a purposeful stride that reminded her of the police officers who frequented the range, but something felt different about these particular visitors. The first man was tall and lean, with short-cropped dark hair and alert eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the space around him. The second was slightly shorter but more heavily built, with the kind of muscular development that spoke of serious physical conditioning. The third man hung back slightly, and Sarah noticed he kept glancing toward the exits and windows. All 3 wore casual clothing that looked expensive but not flashy, and each carried themselves with a confidence that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. "Miss Martinez," Mr. called from behind them, "these are interested in renting lanes for some training exercises. Could you set them up in lanes 1 through 3? Sarah nodded and approached the group with her customer service smile firmly in place. "Of course. Will you be needing ammunition, or did you bring your own?" The tall man stepped forward slightly. "We have our own, thank you. We just need the space for about an hour." His voice was calm and measured, but Sarah detected a tension underneath that made her professional instincts kick in. "No problem at all. I'll get those lanes ready for you." She moved toward the equipment counter to gather the necessary targets and safety equipment. As she worked, she could feel the men watching her, though they tried to be discreet about it. Sarah had learned to read people during her years at the range. Gun enthusiasts came in all types, from nervous first-timers to seasoned professionals, and she had developed a sense for distinguishing between them. These men definitely fell into the professional category, but there was something more intense about their demeanor than even the most serious competitive shooters she had encountered. She finished setting up the lanes and walked back toward the group. "You're all set. Do you need hearing protection or do you have your own?" "We're good, thank you," the shorter man replied. His accent carried a slight southern drawl, and Sarah noticed a small scar running along his left temple. "We appreciate your help." Sarah nodded and began to walk back toward her cleaning duties, but she found herself moving more slowly than usual. Something about the situation felt off, and her instincts were telling her to pay attention. She had learned to trust those instincts during her years working alone at the range, especially during the evening hours when she was often the only employee on duty. The men moved to their assigned lanes and began unpacking equipment from the bags they carried. Sarah continued her cleaning routine, but positioned herself where she could observe them peripherally. They worked efficiently and quietly, laying out weapons and accessories with a kind of practiced precision that confirmed her suspicions about their backgrounds. As she worked, Sarah's mind began to race through possibilities. The men could be law enforcement officers conducting training, though they hadn't mentioned any official capacity. They could be military personnel on leave, though something about their behavior suggested they weren't here for recreational shooting. The more she observed them, the more convinced she became that their presence at the range was connected to something more serious than casual practice. The sound of gunfire began echoing through the building as the men started their training session. Sarah recognized the sharp crack of 9mm rounds, followed by the deeper boom of what sounded like .45 caliber ammunition. The rhythm of their shooting was different from recreational shooters, more controlled and purposeful, with longer pauses between sequences. Sarah continued her work, moving methodically through the remaining lanes while keeping one ear tuned to the activity behind her. The men spoke occasionally, but their voices were low, and she couldn't make out specific words. What she could hear suggested they were communicating in some kind of tactical shorthand, using terms and phrases that reinforced her growing certainty that these were not ordinary customers. Time seemed to move slowly as Sarah worked her way through the cleaning routine. She found herself glancing at the clock more frequently than usual, aware that Emma would be getting out of school soon and that she would need to wrap up her duties to pick up her daughter on time. The thought of Emma waiting at school while Sarah dealt with an uncertain situation at the range made her stomach tighten with anxiety. The shooting continued for another 20 minutes, and then the range fell silent. Sarah heard the men talking among themselves in low voices, and she sensed a change in the atmosphere that made her even more uncomfortable. She finished collecting brass from the final lane and began walking toward the equipment room to store her cleaning supplies. As she passed near lanes 1 through 3, she could see the men examining their targets. The groupings were tight and precise, exactly what she would expect from professional shooters. But their body language suggested they weren't entirely satisfied with their performance, and she heard fragments of conversation that included references to timing and positioning. Sarah stored her supplies and glanced at her watch again. She had about 30 minutes before she needed to leave for the school, which should be plenty of time to complete her remaining tasks and lock up the range. Mr. typically left around this time of day, trusting her to handle the evening closure routine. She walked back toward the front desk to check on any final administrative tasks, passing close enough to the men to overhear part of their conversation. The tall man was speaking in a low voice about timing and coordination, while the shorter man nodded and made notes in a small notebook. The third man continued to monitor the entrances and windows, his attention focused outward rather than on the conversation. Something about their behavior triggered a memory from Sarah's childhood. Her father had been a police detective, and she remembered him explaining how criminals often conducted surveillance before attempting robberies or other crimes. The men's attention to exits, their professional shooting skills, and their obvious discomfort with being observed all combined to create a picture that made Sarah increasingly nervous. She tried to dismiss her concerns as paranoia brought on by too many crime shows and news reports, but her instincts refused to quiet down. Years of working alone at the range had taught her to trust those instincts, and they were currently screaming that something was wrong with this situation. Sarah reached the front desk and began organizing the paperwork for the day's customers. She could see Mr. in his office, reviewing financial documents on his computer. The normalcy of his routine provided some comfort, but she found herself glancing repeatedly toward the shooting lanes where the three men continued their mysterious activities. The afternoon light streaming through the windows had begun to fade, casting longer shadows across the range floor. Sarah realized that the building would be relatively isolated once Mr. left for the day, leaving her alone with customers who made her increasingly uncomfortable. The thought of being alone with these men for even a short period made her consider suggesting that Mr. stay later, though she couldn't think of a reasonable excuse that wouldn't sound ridiculous. As she debated her options, Sarah heard the men beginning to pack up their equipment. The sound of weapons being disassembled and stored was distinctive, and she recognized the efficient movements of people who handled firearms professionally. Part of her felt relieved that their session was ending, but another part worried about what might happen next. The men emerged from the shooting lanes carrying their equipment bags, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The tall man approached the front desk while his companions positioned themselves near the entrance. Sarah noticed that they maintained sight lines to both the front door and the back exit, a positioning that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. "We're finished with the lanes," the tall man said as he reached the desk. "Everything's been cleared and secured." His tone remained professional, but Sarah caught something in his eyes that made her stomach clench with worry. "No problem," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I hope everything met your needs." She began processing the payment for the lane rental, her hands moving automatically through the familiar routine while her mind raced through potential scenarios. As the transaction was completed, Sarah became aware of sounds outside the building that hadn't been there earlier. The distant rumble of multiple vehicles, the slam of car doors, and voices that carried an edge of urgency. The three men noticed the sounds as well, and their body language shifted subtly but unmistakably into a more alert posture. The tall man's hand moved slightly toward his jacket, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what looked like a shoulder holster beneath his clothing. The realization that all three men were almost certainly armed hit her like a physical blow, and she fought to keep her expression neutral while her mind screamed warnings. Outside, the sounds were growing closer and more intense. Sarah could make out the sound of running footsteps and shouted commands, though the words were still indistinct. Whatever was happening, it was moving toward the shooting range with increasing speed and urgency. The three men exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. The shorter man moved toward the back exit, while the third man took a position near the front windows. Their movements were smooth and coordinated, suggesting they had worked together before and knew each other's capabilities. Sarah found herself frozen behind the desk, unsure of what to do or where to go. The situation had transformed from merely uncomfortable to potentially dangerous in a matter of seconds, and she felt completely unprepared to deal with whatever was about to happen. Her thoughts immediately went to Emma, waiting at school and expecting her mother to arrive on time as always. The sounds outside intensified, and Sarah could now clearly hear voices shouting commands. The words "federal agents" and "secure the perimeter" cut through the ambient noise, and she realized that the range was about to become the center of some kind of law enforcement operation. The tall man turned back towards Sarah, and she saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. Whatever these men were involved in, whatever had brought federal agents to the shooting range, she was now caught in the middle of it with no way out and no idea what was about to happen next. The last thing she remembered thinking before the front door exploded inward was that she should have listened to her instincts and called in sick that morning. The front door of Riverside shooting range exploded inward with a deafening crash that sent splinters of wood and metal flying across the reception area. Sarah ducked instinctively behind the front desk as armed figures in tactical gear poured through the opening, their weapons raised, and voices shouting commands that overlapped into an incomprehensible wall of sound. "Federal agents, everyone on the ground, hands where we can see them." The three men who had been renting lanes reacted with lightning speed that confirmed every suspicion Sarah had harbored about their true nature. The tall man vaulted over the counter divider and landed beside her in a crouch, his weapon already drawn. The shorter man had disappeared entirely, presumably through the back exit he had been monitoring. The third man pressed himself against the wall near the front windows, returning fire at the agents streaming through the entrance. Gunfire erupted throughout the building with an intensity that made Sarah's ears ring despite the hearing protection she habitually wore at work. The sharp crack of pistol rounds mixed with the deeper thunder of rifle fire, creating a cacophony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Bullets sparked off concrete walls and shattered the glass partitions that separated the shooting lanes from the main floor. Sarah pressed herself against the floor behind the desk, her mind struggling to process the chaos unfolding around her. The familiar environment of her workplace had been transformed into a war zone in a matter of seconds. The smell of gunpowder, normally a subtle background scent, now filled the air with choking intensity. "Stay down and don't move," the tall man hissed at her, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "This isn't about you, but you're in it now whether you like it or not." Through the gaps in the desk structure, Sarah could see federal agents advancing through the shooting range with tactical precision. They moved in coordinated teams, using the lane dividers and concrete support pillars for cover as they methodically cleared the building. Their equipment and training were obviously superior to that of the men they were pursuing, but her unwilling companions were putting up fierce resistance. Mr.'s office door was closed, and Sarah prayed that he had found a way to secure himself inside or escape through one of the rear exits. The thought of her elderly boss caught in the crossfire added another layer of terror to her already overwhelming situation. The tall man beside her spoke rapidly into what appeared to be a concealed radio or phone, though the words were too quiet and technical for Sarah to understand. She caught fragments like compromised position and extraction route, but the meaning was lost in the chaos of ongoing combat. A flashbang grenade detonated somewhere near the front entrance, filling the air with brilliant white light and a concussive blast that left Sarah's ears ringing even more intensely. The temporary blindness and disorientation seemed to affect everyone in the building, causing a momentary lull in the gunfire that was quickly followed by renewed intensity. During the brief quiet, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze, the distant wail of sirens approaching from multiple directions. Whatever was happening at the shooting range was escalating beyond a simple arrest operation. The sound of additional emergency vehicles suggested that this confrontation had become a major incident that would draw attention from across the region. The tall man's radio crackled with an incoming transmission that Sarah could partially make out. "Bravo team in position. Alpha requesting immediate extraction. Situation deteriorating rapidly." The professional military terminology confirmed her growing realization that she was caught between highly trained operatives on both sides of a conflict she didn't understand. Bullets continued to fly overhead, some embedding themselves in the concrete walls with sharp impacts that sent chips and dust raining down on Sarah's position. She had never experienced actual combat before, and the reality was far more terrifying and disorienting than anything she had seen in movies or television. The noise alone was overwhelming, but the knowledge that any one of those bullets could end her life added a paralyzing fear that made it difficult to think clearly. The federal agents were making steady progress through the building, their superior numbers and coordination gradually overwhelming the defensive positions. Sarah could hear their commands becoming clearer as they moved closer. "Room clear. Advancing to Sector 3. Suspect down in Lane 7. The tall man beside her seemed to recognize that their position was becoming untenable. He spoke more urgently into his communication device, and Sarah heard fragments of what sounded like contingency plans being activated. The professional nature of his responses suggested that this kind of situation had been anticipated and prepared for, though clearly not in this specific location. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors approaching the building. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that whatever was happening had escalated to the point where aerial support was being brought in. The vibration of the aircraft's engines added to the already overwhelming sensory assault. Through a gap in the desk, Sarah could see tactical agents advancing down the shooting lanes with systematic precision. They moved in teams of 2 or 3, covering each other as they cleared potential hiding spots and checked for additional threats. Their equipment included night vision devices and tactical lights that cut through the shadows created by the building's emergency lighting system. The helicopter's spotlights suddenly blazed through the front windows, filling the interior of the range with harsh white light that eliminated most of the shadows that had provided concealment. The tall man cursed under his breath and adjusted his position to avoid the illuminated areas, pulling Sarah along with him as he moved. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice urgent but controlled. "My name is Jake, and I'm a Navy SEAL. This operation has gone sideways, and you're caught in the middle through no fault of your own. If you do exactly what I say, I'll get you out of this alive." The revelation that she was trapped with a Navy SEAL added another layer of confusion to Sarah's already overwhelming situation. Navy SEALs were supposed to be the good guys, elite military operatives who served their country with honor. But the fact that federal agents were trying to arrest or kill this particular SEAL suggested that the situation was far more complicated than simple good versus evil. "What's happening?" Sarah managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the continued gunfire and helicopter noise. "Why are they trying to kill you?" "It's complicated," Jake replied, checking his weapon and scanning the area around their position. "Right now, the only thing that matters is staying alive long enough to figure out an exit strategy. This building is going to be completely surrounded in minutes, and we need to find a way out before that happens." The federal agents had reached the halfway point of the shooting range and were establishing new positions that would allow them to advance on the remaining defensive positions. Sarah could see them coordinating their movements with hand signals and radio communications, their training evident in every action they took. Another explosion shook the building as what sounded like breaching charges were detonated somewhere near the rear exits. The sound was followed by shouting voices and additional gunfire, suggesting that Jake's companions were facing similar pressure from multiple directions. The tactical situation was clearly deteriorating rapidly for the defending forces. Jake's radio crackled again with an urgent transmission. "Primary extraction compromised. Secondary route under fire. All units execute dispersal protocol." The military terminology was lost on Sarah, but the tone of voice suggested that whatever plan had originally been in place was falling apart. The helicopter spotlight swept across their position, forcing both Sarah and Jake to press themselves even lower against the floor. The intense illumination revealed details of their surroundings that had been hidden in shadow, including additional damage to the building and evidence of the fierce firefight that was still ongoing. Sarah noticed that Jake was bleeding from what appeared to be a graze on his left arm, though he seemed unaware of the injury or was ignoring it completely. His focus remained entirely on their tactical situation and the movements of the federal agents who were continuing their methodical advance through the building. "We need to move," Jake said, his voice carrying a note of urgency that made Sarah's stomach tighten with fresh fear. "They're going to have this area surrounded in minutes, and our current position will be untenable once they bring up heavier equipment." The thought of moving from their relatively secure position behind the desk terrified Sarah, but she could see that Jake was right about their situation becoming hopeless if they remained stationary. The federal agents were advancing with professional precision that would eventually overwhelm any defensive position, no matter how well concealed. Jake reached into his tactical vest and produced what appeared to be a small explosive device. "This is a diversionary charge," he explained quietly. "When I detonate it, we're going to move toward the rear of the building. Stay low, follow me exactly, and don't stop for anything you see or hear." The reality of what Jake was proposing hit Sarah like a physical blow. She was about to become an active participant in a firefight with federal agents, something that could result in criminal charges even if she survived the immediate violence. But the alternative appeared to be remaining in a position that would soon become a death trap. "What about Mr.?" Sarah asked, thinking of her boss who might still be trapped somewhere in the building. "If he's smart, he's already called 911 and found a secure location," Jake replied. "Right now, I can't save everyone. My priority is getting you out of this situation that you didn't ask to be part of." The federal agents had advanced close enough that Sarah could hear individual voices clearly. Commands like "check that corner" and "cover the entrance to lane 12" indicated that they were conducting a thorough and systematic search of the entire facility. The professional nature of their operation suggested that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment raid, but rather a carefully planned operation that had been in development for some time. Jake positioned the diversionary charge and began counting down on his fingers. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she prepared to run through an active combat zone, something she had never imagined she would have to do. The mundane routine of her job cleaning shooting lanes seemed like a memory from another lifetime. 3, 2, 1. The explosion was smaller than Sarah had expected, but the flash and sound were sufficient to create momentary confusion among the advancing agents. Jake immediately moved from their position, staying low and using the shooting lane dividers for concealment as he headed toward the rear of the building. Sarah followed as closely as she could, her body moving on pure adrenaline while her mind struggled to process the surreal nature of her situation. Bullets continued to fly around them, though most of the gunfire seemed to be concentrated in other areas of the building, where Jake's companions were still fighting their running battle with the federal forces. The rear section of the shooting range contained storage areas and maintenance rooms that Sarah knew well from her daily work routine. The familiar environment provided some comfort even in the midst of chaos, and she was able to guide Jake toward exits and hiding spots that might not be immediately obvious to the pursuing agents. As they moved through the maze of equipment and storage areas, Sarah could hear the federal agents coordinating their search behind them. Radio chatter indicated that they were aware of movement in the rear section and were redirecting resources to cut off escape routes. The professional efficiency of their response suggested that Jake's assessment of their situation had been accurate. They were running out of time and options. The sound of helicopter rotors had intensified, suggesting that additional aircraft had arrived to support the ground operation. Through small windows in the rear section, Sarah could see spotlights sweeping the parking areas and adjacent buildings as aerial units established a perimeter around the entire facility. Jake paused at a junction between storage rooms, listening intently to the sounds around them and checking his communication device for updates from his team. The grim expression on his face suggested that the news was not encouraging, and Sarah felt her hope for a peaceful resolution continuing to fade. "The building is completely surrounded," Jake said quietly. "We need to find a position where we can make a stand until extraction arrives or until we can negotiate a way out of this situation." The word extraction suggested that Jake's team had backup resources available, but Sarah wondered what kind of extraction could be effective against the level of federal response that had descended on the shooting range. The sound of sirens and helicopters indicated that this had become a major law enforcement operation involving multiple agencies and significant resources. Sarah followed Jake through the maze of storage rooms and maintenance areas, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the pursuing federal agents would hear it. The familiar layout of the building's rear section felt foreign and threatening in the chaos of combat, shadows that had never seemed ominous now appearing to hide potential threats around every corner. Jake moved with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to operating in hostile environments, his weapon ready, but his movements calculated to avoid unnecessary noise. He paused frequently to listen for signs of pursuit, his head tilted slightly as he processed the complex symphony of sounds that filled the building. Distant gunfire, radio chatter, helicopter rotors, and the methodical advance of tactical teams. They reached a maintenance room that Sarah used for storing cleaning supplies and equipment. Jake examined the space quickly, noting the concrete walls, limited access points, and small window that provided a view of the rear parking area. His tactical assessment was swift but thorough, and Sarah could see him mentally both defensive advantages and potential escape routes. "This will work for now," Jake said, positioning himself where he could monitor the approach corridor while maintaining sight lines to the window. "We need to assess our situation and figure out our next move." Through the small window, Sarah could see the full extent of the law enforcement response that had descended on the shooting range. Federal agents in tactical gear had established a perimeter around the entire building, with additional personnel arriving in armored vehicles that looked more military than civilian. The helicopter spotlight continued to sweep the area, turning night into harsh daylight wherever its beam touched. "Jake," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to know what's really happening here. You said you're a Navy SEAL, but federal agents don't usually try to kill Navy SEALs unless something has gone very wrong." Jake was quiet for a moment, his attention divided between monitoring for threats and making a decision about how much information to share. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time. 3 months ago, my team was conducting a classified operation in Eastern Europe," he began, checking his weapon while he talked. We discovered evidence that someone high up in the government was selling intelligence to foreign operatives. When we tried to report it through proper channels, we found out that the corruption went deeper than we thought. The explanation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The man beside her wasn't just a Navy SEAL caught in some kind of misunderstanding. He was apparently involved in exposing government corruption at the highest levels. The federal agents trying to capture or kill him weren't necessarily the good guys in this situation. We have evidence that could expose a network of traitors, Jake continued. But the same people we were supposed to trust with that evidence are the ones trying to silence us. My team scattered after our first attempt to make contact with clean elements in the intelligence community went wrong. How do I know you're telling the truth? Sarah asked, though something in Jake's demeanor suggested that he was being honest about their desperate situation. Jake reached into his tactical vest and produced a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. This contains encrypted files that prove everything I've told you. Bank records, communication intercepts, photographic evidence of meetings between high-level officials and known enemy agents. It's enough to bring down a dozen politicians and intelligence officials. The device seemed too small and ordinary to contain information that could justify the massive law enforcement response surrounding them. But Sarah had learned that reality often failed to match the dramatic expectations created by movies and television. Real espionage and government corruption probably did involve files stored on electronic devices, rather than dramatic confrontations in exotic locations. Why didn't you just release the information to the press? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand the complexity of Jake's situation. We tried that first, Jake replied grimly. 2 journalists who were investigating our claims died in what were ruled accidents within a week of each other. After that, we realized that the corruption network had resources and reach that made normal channels too dangerous to use. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside their hiding place cut short their conversation. Jake immediately shifted into combat mode, raising his weapon and motioning for Sarah to move to the most protected corner of the maintenance room. The methodical nature of the approaching sounds suggested that federal agents had reached their section of the building and were beginning a systematic search. Jake's radio crackled with a transmission in what sounded like military code. Eagle Actual to Hawk 2. Primary package secured. Secondary objectives compromised. Recommend immediate exfiltration. The professional terminology was mostly incomprehensible to Sarah, but the urgent tone suggested that whatever larger operation Jake's team had been conducting was falling apart. That's my team leader, Jake explained quietly. He's telling me that they've secured the primary evidence but that the rest of the mission has gone wrong. They're recommending that we get out of here immediately. How exactly do we get out? Sarah asked, looking around the maintenance room that suddenly felt more like a tomb than a hiding place. The building is surrounded, there are helicopters overhead, and federal agents are searching room by room. Jake checked his communication device and studied the tactical display that appeared on its screen. Sarah could see what appeared to be a building schematic overlaid with red and blue dots that presumably represented friendly and hostile forces. The tactical situation looked hopeless from her untrained perspective, with blue dots vastly outnumbering the scattered red ones. There's a drainage tunnel that runs under this section of the building, Jake said, studying the display intently. It connects to the storm water system for the entire industrial complex. If we can reach the access point, we might be able to move underground until we're outside the perimeter. The thought of crawling through drainage tunnels while federal agents searched for them above ground seemed terrifying, but Sarah realized that their alternatives were extremely limited. Staying in their current position would eventually result in capture or death, and attempting to fight their way out against overwhelming odds would be suicide. The footsteps in the corridor had grown closer, accompanied by voices coordinating the search effort. Sarah could hear agents calling out room numbers and status reports as they methodically cleared each space. The professional efficiency of their approach suggested that they would reach the maintenance room within minutes. Jake moved to the door and listened intently to the activity outside. His body language suggested that he was calculating timing and distances, preparing for whatever action would be necessary to reach the drainage tunnel access point he had identified. Sarah watched him work and found herself amazed by the transformation from the polite customer who had rented shooting lanes earlier that afternoon. The access panel is in the floor of the adjacent storage room, Jake explained, showing Sarah the tactical display on his device. We'll have about 30 seconds to get there and get underground before the search teams reach this corridor. Sarah studied the route Jake was indicating and realized that it would require them to cross an open hallway that could be under observation by the advancing agents. The timing would have to be perfect, and any mistake would result in immediate contact with heavily armed federal operatives who believed they were pursuing dangerous criminals. "What about Mr.?" Sarah asked again, unable to stop worrying about her boss despite their desperate circumstances. Jake checked his tactical display and pointed to a blue dot in the front section of the building. "If that reading is accurate, there's a civilian being held in protective custody near the front desk area. He's probably safe as long as he cooperates with the agents." The knowledge that Mr. was apparently secure provided some relief, but Sarah realized that her own situation was far more complicated. She was now actively hiding from federal agents in the company of someone they considered a fugitive, which would make her complicity in whatever crimes they believed Jake had committed. "Once we're in the tunnel system, then what?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to accept that she had little choice but to trust Jake's plan. "My extraction team has a vehicle positioned outside the perimeter," Jake replied. "If we can reach the rendezvous point, we can get you to safety before making our own escape." The sound of doors being forcefully opened echoed through the corridor, indicating that the search teams had reached their immediate area. Sarah could hear agents calling "clear" as they finished examining each room, their voices growing closer with each report. Jake moved to the maintenance room door and prepared to open it, his weapon ready and his body coiled for rapid movement. He looked back at Sarah with an expression that was both apologetic and determined. "I'm sorry you got caught up in this," he said. "None of this was supposed to happen at your workplace, and you don't deserve to be in danger because of decisions my team made. But right now, getting you out alive is my responsibility." Sarah nodded, though her mind was still struggling to process the complete transformation of her ordinary workday into a life-or-death situation involving government corruption, military operatives, and underground escape routes. The mundane routine of cleaning shooting lanes and collecting brass casings seemed like something from another person's life. Jake cracked the door open slightly and peered out into the corridor. His body language suggested that the timing was as good as it was likely to get, though Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders that indicated the extreme danger of their situation. "Stay behind me, move quickly but quietly, and don't look back no matter what you hear," Jake instructed. "Once we start moving, we're committed to reaching that access panel no matter what happens." The sound of tactical teams had grown close enough that Sarah could distinguish individual voices and radio transmissions. Commands like, "Check that storage room," and "Maintain sight lines to all exits," indicated that they had only moments before the search reached their hiding place. Jake opened the door and moved into the corridor with fluid precision, his weapon raised and his attention focused on potential threats from multiple directions. Sarah followed as closely as she could, her civilian clothing and lack of tactical training making her feel vulnerable and exposed in the harsh lighting of the corridor. They covered the distance to the adjacent storage room in seconds that felt like hours, every step accompanied by the expectation of discovery and gunfire. The door to the storage room was unlocked, and Jake quickly ushered Sarah inside before sealing the entrance behind them. The storage room was smaller than the maintenance room they had just left, filled with equipment and supplies that created both concealment and obstacles. Jake immediately began searching for the floor access panel he had identified on his tactical display, moving boxes and equipment with controlled urgency. Sarah heard voices in the corridor outside growing louder and more specific. "Room 7 clear. Moving to room 8. Maintain perimeter security." The systematic nature of the search meant that they had perhaps 2 minutes before agents reached their new hiding place. "Found it," Jake said, locating a metal panel in the floor near the back corner of the storage room. The panel was secured with standard bolts that he began removing with a multi-tool from his vest. The sound of metal on metal seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. As Jake worked to open the access panel, Sarah could hear the search teams reaching the maintenance room they had just vacated. Voices called "clear" after examining their former hiding place, but she noticed a change in tone that suggested the agents had found some sign of their presence. "They know we were there," Jake said, apparently reaching the same conclusion. "We need to get underground immediately." The access panel came free, revealing a dark opening that led down into what appeared to be a concrete tunnel. The space looked cramped and uninviting, but it represented their only realistic chance of escaping the building without engaging in a firefight against overwhelming odds. Jake lowered himself into the opening first, then reached up to help Sarah follow. The tunnel was larger than it had appeared from above, though still confined enough to require crawling rather than walking upright. The concrete was cold and damp, and the air carried the musty smell of underground drainage systems. As soon as Sarah was clear of the opening, Jake replaced the access panel from below, using his multi-tool to secure it enough that casual inspection might not reveal their escape route. The tunnel fell into complete darkness as the panel sealed them off from the storage room above. Jake activated a small tactical light that provided minimal illumination without compromising their concealment. The tunnel stretched away in both directions, disappearing into darkness that could contain either escape or additional dangers. The tunnel system connects to the main storm drainage for this entire industrial area, Jake explained, consulting his tactical display. "If we can reach the primary junction, we should be able to navigate to an exit point outside the federal perimeter." Sarah followed Jake into the darkness of the drainage tunnel, leaving behind the familiar world of her workplace and entering a subterranean environment where the rules of normal life no longer applied. Above them, she could hear the continued sounds of the search, muffled but persistent, as federal agents worked to locate the fugitives who had vanished from their systematic sweep. Tunnel ahead stretched into uncertainty, offering both hope for escape and the possibility of becoming trapped underground with no way out. Sarah realized that her life had been irreversibly changed by the events of the afternoon, and that even if she survived the immediate crisis, she would never again be able to return to the simple routine of her job at the shooting range. The drainage tunnel was a nightmare of concrete walls, stagnant water, and oppressive darkness that pressed against Sarah from all sides. She followed Jake's tactical light as they crawled through the cramped space, her knees and hands already aching from the rough concrete surface. The sound of their movement seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, every scrape and splash echoing off the walls in ways that made her certain they would be discovered. Above them, the sounds of the federal search had intensified. Sarah could hear footsteps directly overhead, accompanied by the distant barking of what sounded like search dogs. The realization that agents were using canine units to track them added a new layer of terror to their already desperate situation. She had no idea whether their scent trail would lead the dogs to the drainage access panel they had used. Jake moved with practiced efficiency even in the cramped tunnel conditions, consulting his tactical device periodically to maintain their heading toward the main drainage junction. The electronic display cast an eerie blue glow that provided brief glimpses of their surroundings. Concrete walls stained with decades of water damage, patches of moss and algae, and the occasional piece of debris that had been washed into the system during storms. "How far to the junction?" Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was keeping her voice low in the underground environment. "About 200 meters, Jake replied, his voice strained from the physical effort of crawling through the tunnel. "The main drainage line is large enough to walk upright, and it connects to multiple exit points throughout the industrial district." The promise of being able to stand upright again provided motivation for Sarah to continue moving despite the pain in her knees and the growing claustrophobia of the confined space. She had never considered herself particularly afraid of enclosed spaces, but crawling through a drainage tunnel while being pursued by federal agents was testing limits she hadn't known she possessed. Water began to appear in the tunnel floor, initially just damp spots that soaked through Sarah's clothing, but gradually increasing to shallow puddles that splashed with each movement. The water was cold and carried an unpleasant smell that suggested it contained more than just rainwater runoff from the surrounding buildings. Jake paused periodically to listen for sounds that might indicate pursuit, though the acoustic properties of the tunnel system made it difficult to determine the source and direction of any noises. Sarah strained to hear anything that might suggest federal agents had discovered their escape route, but the underground environment distorted sound in ways that made every noise seem both distant and threatening. "The search dogs are definitely tracking something," Jake said, after listening to sounds filtering down through drainage grates they passed beneath. They may have picked up our scent trail from the storage room. The thought of search dogs following them through the drainage system created images in Sarah's mind that made her stomach clench with fear. She had no experience with police procedures or tactical operations, but she assumed that trained dogs would be able to track their movements through the tunnel system more efficiently than human agents. They reached a section where the tunnel began to slope downward more steeply, and the water level increased correspondingly. Sarah found herself crawling through several inches of cold, foul-smelling water that soaked through her clothing and made every movement more difficult. The tactical light revealed that they were approaching a larger space ahead, though the details remained hidden in the darkness beyond the light's range. The main drainage junction was a circular chamber approximately 10 feet in diameter, with multiple tunnel entrances at different levels. The space was large enough for them to stand upright for the first time since entering the underground system, providing blessed relief for Sarah's aching knees and back. Water flowed through the chamber from various sources, creating a constant sound of movement that would help mask their presence. Jake immediately began examining the different tunnel options, consulting his tactical device to determine which route would provide the best chance of reaching safety outside the federal perimeter. The electronic display showed their current location within the larger drainage network, with potential exit points marked in green and known hazards or dead ends marked in red. "We have 3 viable options," Jake explained, pointing to the different tunnel entrances around the chamber. "The main storm drain runs directly under the highway and comes out near the industrial park entrance. The secondary system connects to the residential area about half a mile from here. The third option is an older tunnel that was part of the original construction, but may not be fully mapped by federal agencies." Each option carried different risks and advantages that Sarah was not qualified to evaluate, but she could see that Jake was weighing factors like distance, concealment, and the likelihood of encountering additional law enforcement personnel. The tactical situation had become complex enough that even someone with his training was struggling to identify a clearly superior choice. Sounds from above indicated that the search was continuing with undiminished intensity. Sarah could hear helicopter rotors, vehicle engines, and the distant barking of search dogs, all suggesting that federal agents were expanding their perimeter and bringing additional resources to bear on the situation. The longer they remained in the area, the more likely it became that their escape routes would be discovered and blocked. Jake's communication device crackled with an incoming transmission that he listened to intently. Sarah could make out fragments of military jargon and code words, but the meaning was lost on her civilian understanding. Jake's expression grew more concerned as he processed the information, suggesting that the news was not encouraging. "My team leader reports that federal agencies have requested military support for this operation," Jake explained after the transmission ended. "They're bringing in additional helicopters and specialized tracking equipment. Our window for escape is closing rapidly." The revelation that military resources were being deployed against them elevated the situation beyond anything Sarah had imagined possible. The idea that her afternoon at work would result in her being pursued by military forces seemed surreal, but the evidence of escalating response was all around them in the sounds filtering down from above. Water levels in the drainage chamber began to rise, apparently due to increased flow from storm drains throughout the area. Sarah realized that their underground refuge could become dangerous if the water continued to rise, potentially trapping them in a system designed to handle much larger volumes during actual storms. "We need to choose a route and move immediately," Jake said, noting the rising water levels. "The longer we remain stationary, the more likely it becomes that we'll be trapped down here." Jake selected the older tunnel system, reasoning that its incomplete mapping would provide the best chance of avoiding federal surveillance. The entrance was partially concealed behind a concrete support beam, and the tunnel itself was smaller than the main drainage lines, requiring them to return to crawling positions. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the junction chamber, Sarah heard new sounds from above that made her heart race with fresh terror. The distinctive sound of drilling or cutting equipment suggested that federal agents were beginning to access the drainage system directly, probably through maintenance access points or by creating new openings. "They're coming underground," Jake confirmed, his tactical training allowing him to interpret the sounds more accurately than Sarah could. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach this junction." The older tunnel was more difficult to navigate than the drainage line they had used initially. The concrete was rougher and more deteriorated, with obstacles created by decades of debris accumulation and structural damage. Sarah found herself struggling to keep up with Jake's pace while avoiding sharp edges and unstable sections that could cause injury or noise. The tunnel sloped upward gradually, suggesting that they were moving toward higher ground and potentially toward the surface. Sarah's civilian clothes were completely soaked and filthy from the drainage water, and her hands were scraped and bleeding from contact with the rough concrete surfaces. The physical demands of underground escape were far beyond anything she had experienced in her normal life. Jake paused frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit, and Sarah could see the tension in his posture increasing with each stop. The tactical situation was clearly deteriorating, and even his military training was being pushed to its limits by the resources being deployed against them. "The tunnel ahead connects to a utility access shaft," Jake said, consulting his device again. "If we can reach the surface through that route, we'll be approximately 3 blocks outside the original federal perimeter." The promise of reaching the surface provided motivation for Sarah to continue despite her exhaustion and growing despair. The underground environment had become a claustrophobic nightmare that made her appreciate simple things like fresh air and natural light that she had always taken for granted. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had grown more distinct. Sarah could hear voices echoing through the drainage system, along with the splash of federal agents moving through the same water they had traversed. The professional efficiency of the search suggested that their escape route had been discovered and was being systematically followed. "They're in the tunnels," Jake confirmed grimly. "We need to reach the surface access point before they catch up with us." The older tunnel began to deteriorate further as they progressed, with sections where the concrete had cracked or partially collapsed. Sarah found herself squeezing through gaps that barely accommodated her body, while Jake used his superior strength and training to navigate obstacles that would have been impossible for her to manage alone. Water continued to be a problem, though the levels varied depending on the specific section of tunnel they were traversing. In some areas, they crawled through relatively dry concrete, while in others they were forced to move through standing water that reached their elbows and soaked through every piece of clothing they wore. The utility access shaft Jake had identified appeared ahead as a vertical opening with metal rungs leading upward toward what appeared to be a concrete cover. The sight of the ladder leading toward the surface was the most beautiful thing Sarah had seen since their underground ordeal began. Jake tested the ladder rungs to ensure they would support their weight, then began climbing toward the access cover. Sarah followed as quickly as her exhausted condition would allow, her muscles screaming from the combination of crawling, climbing, and the stress of constant fear. At the top of the access shaft, Jake paused to listen for sounds from the surface that might indicate federal surveillance of the exit point. The concrete cover was heavy and would require significant effort to move, creating noise that could attract attention from any agents positioned above ground. "I'm going to open this slowly," Jake whispered. "If there are agents waiting above, we'll need to retreat back into the tunnel system and find an alternate route." Sarah clung to the metal rungs below Jake, her body shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline as she waited for him to determine whether their escape route was viable. The sounds of pursuit in the tunnel below had grown close enough that retreat might not be possible if the surface exit was compromised. Jake began to lift the concrete cover slowly, creating a narrow gap that allowed him to observe the surface environment. Sarah could see a sliver of late afternoon sky through the opening, natural light that seemed impossibly bright after their time in the underground darkness. "The exit is clear," Jake reported quietly. "But we need to move quickly to reach the extraction point before federal agents expand their search perimeter to include this area." Sarah climbed the remaining rungs and emerged onto the surface through the utility access opening, grateful beyond words to breathe fresh air and feel sunlight on her face. They had emerged in an alley behind industrial buildings, several blocks from the shooting range that had become the center of the federal operation. The sounds of helicopters and sirens were still audible in the distance, but the immediate area appeared to be clear of law enforcement personnel. Sarah could see that the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the buildings that would provide some concealment for their continued escape. Jake quickly replaced the concrete cover and consulted his tactical device to determine their exact location and the direction toward the extraction point his team had established. The electronic display showed their position relative to the federal perimeter and the route they would need to follow to reach safety. The extraction point is approximately 6 blocks from here, Jake explained. We need to move carefully but quickly, staying away from main roads and avoiding any contact with law enforcement or military personnel. Sarah nodded, though she was beginning to understand that her involvement in Jake's mission was far from over. Even if they successfully reached the extraction point, she would need to decide whether to trust his story about government corruption and join his team's efforts to expose the conspiracy, or attempt to return to her normal life despite everything she had witnessed. The alley behind the industrial buildings provided temporary concealment, but Sarah could see that their escape was far from complete. The distant sounds of helicopters and search activities served as a constant reminder that federal agents were systematically expanding their search perimeter, and it would only be a matter of time before their current location was included in the operation. Jake led the way through a maze of back streets and service alleys, his tactical training evident in the route selection that avoided main roads and potential observation points. Sarah struggled to keep pace, her legs unsteady from exhaustion and the aftereffects of adrenaline that had sustained her through the underground escape. Her civilian clothes were filthy and torn from their journey through the drainage tunnels, making her acutely aware of how much she stood out in any normal environment. They paused at the intersection of 2 alleys while Jake checked his tactical device for updates on the federal search pattern and communications from his extraction team. The electronic display showed red zones expanding outward from the shooting range, indicating areas that were under active surveillance or had been secured by law enforcement personnel. The extraction point is still clear, Jake reported, though his expression remained concerned. But my team reports increased military helicopter activity throughout the area. They're bringing in thermal imaging equipment that could make concealment much more difficult. The mention of thermal imaging added another layer of complexity to their escape that Sarah hadn't considered. Her understanding of such technology came primarily from movies and television, but she realized that their body heat would make them visible to specialized equipment even if they remained hidden from visual observation. As they resumed moving toward the extraction point, Sarah found herself thinking about Emma, who would be expecting to be picked up from school. The afternoon that had begun with routine cleaning tasks at the shooting range had stretched into evening, and her daughter would be wondering why her mother hadn't arrived on time. The guilt of letting Emma down was almost as painful as the physical exhaustion of their escape. "What happens to my normal life after this?" Sarah asked during another pause in their movement. "Even if we escape, I can't just go back to work tomorrow and pretend none of this happened." Jake's expression showed understanding and regret for the position she had been forced into through no choice of her own. "You're right that your normal life has been disrupted," he said. "The people we're fighting have resources and reach that make them extremely dangerous to anyone who becomes involved in exposing their activities." The implication that she was now permanently entangled in Jake's mission against government corruption was terrifying, but Sarah was beginning to understand that she might not have alternatives. Simply walking away and returning to her job at the shooting range would leave her vulnerable to retaliation from the same forces that were trying to eliminate Jake and his team. They reached the edge of the industrial district and faced the challenge of crossing several blocks of mixed commercial and residential development to reach the extraction point. The area was more heavily populated and offered fewer concealment options, but it also provided the advantage of civilian activity that might help them blend in despite their disheveled appearance. Jake's communication device crackled with an urgent transmission from his team. "Federal agencies have requested National Guard support for expanded search operations. Multiple roadblocks being established throughout the sector. Extraction window closing rapidly." The escalation to National Guard involvement indicated that the federal response had grown far beyond a simple manhunt. Sarah realized that Jake's claims about high-level government corruption were being taken seriously enough by someone in authority to justify military deployment on American soil, something she had never imagined she would witness. "We need to reach the extraction point within the next 15 minutes, Jake said, studying the tactical display on his device. After that, the area will be too heavily secured for safe extraction, and my team will be forced to abort the mission. The pressure of the deadline added urgency to their movement, but it also increased the risk of making mistakes that could result in their capture. Sarah could see Jake weighing the competing demands of speed and stealth as he planned their route through the more populated areas ahead. They emerged from the industrial district onto a residential street lined with modest homes and apartment buildings. The normal activities of evening life continued around them, people returning from work, children playing in yards, families preparing dinner. The contrast between the ordinary domestic scene and their desperate flight from federal agents was surreal and disorienting. Jake led them along sidewalks and through residential yards, staying away from main streets where roadblocks might have been established. Sarah found herself grateful for the approaching darkness, which would provide additional concealment, but also made navigation more challenging in unfamiliar neighborhoods. The sound of helicopters had intensified, and Sarah could see aircraft with searchlights beginning to systematically sweep residential areas. The expanding search pattern suggested that federal agents were confident that their targets were still in the general vicinity and were preparing to conduct a comprehensive search that would eventually locate any hiding places. There, Jake said, pointing toward a commercial area ahead where a small parking lot held several civilian vehicles. That's our extraction point. Sarah could see a nondescript sedan parked near the edge of the lot, with two figures visible in the front seats. The vehicle looked ordinary enough to avoid attention, but its positioning and the alertness of its occupants suggested that this was indeed Jake's extraction team. As they approached the parking lot, Jake's communication device received another urgent transmission. Federal roadblock established on Highway 15. National Guard units deploying to residential sectors 7 through 12. Recommend immediate extraction and dispersal. The military terminology was mostly lost on Sarah, but the urgency in the transmission was unmistakable. Whatever window of opportunity had allowed Jake's team to maintain their extraction point was closing rapidly, and delay would result in their capture by the expanding federal operation. Jake signaled to the extraction team using what appeared to be a small tactical light, flashing a specific pattern that received an immediate response from the vehicle. The rear door of the sedan opened, revealing a third person who gestured for them to approach quickly. As they crossed the open space of the parking lot, Sarah felt completely exposed and vulnerable. The distance to the extraction vehicle seemed impossibly far, and she expected federal agents to appear from behind buildings or vehicles at any moment. The sound of helicopters seemed to grow louder with each step, though she realized that her heightened stress was probably making her more sensitive to every sound. They reached the sedan and climbed quickly into the back seat, where Sarah found herself sitting beside another person in tactical gear who immediately began scanning the surrounding area for signs of pursuit. The driver started the engine and began moving toward the parking lot exit with smooth efficiency that avoided drawing attention while still maintaining urgency. "Jake, SEAL Team 6, Jake said, introducing himself to the extraction team. "This is Sarah Martinez, civilian contractor who got caught up in the operation at the shooting range. She needs protection and extraction." The term civilian contractor was technically accurate, but didn't capture the reality of how Sarah had become involved in their mission. She was simply a working mother who had been cleaning shooting lanes when Jake's operation went wrong. But she understood that military personnel probably needed to categorize her involvement in terms they could process quickly. "I'm Commander, Jake's team leader," the person beside Sarah said. "We have a safe house approximately 20 minutes from here where we can debrief and plan our next moves. The federal response to this operation has been more extensive than we anticipated." As the sedan moved through residential streets away from the shooting range and the expanding federal search, Sarah finally had a moment to process the magnitude of what had happened to her life in the span of a single afternoon. She had gone from routine cleaning duties to underground escape to extraction by military operatives, and her involvement in exposing government corruption was apparently just beginning. "What about my daughter?" Sarah asked, the reality of her changed circumstances finally hitting her with full force. "She's at school waiting for me to pick her up, and I can't just disappear from her life." Commander and Jake exchanged glances that suggested they had discussed this complication during their escape from the shooting range. "We can arrange for secure pickup and protection for your daughter," said. "But you need to understand that your involvement in this operation has made both of you targets for retaliation by the people we're fighting." The realization that Emma was also now in danger because of Sarah's accidental involvement with Jake's mission hit her like a physical blow. Her 8-year-old daughter had done nothing to deserve being caught up in a conflict involving government corruption and military operations. But the reality of their situation meant that normal life was no longer possible. "The evidence we've gathered implicates people with the resources and authority to make problems disappear," Jake explained. "Anyone who becomes aware of that evidence becomes a potential threat to their operations, which makes them a target for elimination." Sarah understood that Jake was trying to explain the seriousness of their situation without terrifying her completely, but the implications were clear enough. She and Emma would need protection and probably relocation if they were going to survive the exposure of the corruption network that Jake's team had discovered. The sedan continued through residential areas that looked increasingly unfamiliar to Sarah, heading toward whatever safe house commander's team had established. She realized that she was now completely dependent on people she had just met, trusting them with her life and her daughter's safety based on Jake's claims about government corruption and his actions during their escape. "The safe house has secure communications that will allow us to coordinate pickup for your daughter," said, apparently understanding Sarah's primary concern. "We have resources and contacts that can ensure her safety while we determine the best long-term solution for both of you." As they drove away from the chaos they had left behind at the shooting range, Sarah could see the glow of searchlights in the distance, illuminating the ongoing federal operation that had transformed her workplace into a combat zone. The normal routine of her life seemed like a memory from another person's experience, replaced by a reality that involved military extraction teams, government corruption, and protective custody. "What happens next?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she was prepared for the answer. "First, we secure your daughter and get both of you to a location where the corruption network can't reach you," Commander replied. "Then, we continue our mission to expose the people who have been selling our country's secrets to foreign enemies. Your testimony about what happened at the shooting range will be part of that evidence." Sarah realized that her involvement in Jake's mission was no longer accidental or temporary. She was now a witness to federal operations that had attempted to silence military personnel who had discovered evidence of treason. Her decision to help Jake escape from the shooting range had made her a participant in exposing corruption that reached the highest levels of government. The sedan turned into the driveway of a modest suburban house that looked completely ordinary from the outside. The appearance of normalcy was probably deliberate, Sarah realized, providing concealment for whatever military operations were being conducted inside. As they approached the safe house, Sarah made a decision that would determine the course of her life going forward. She would trust Jake's team to protect Emma and help expose the corruption they had discovered, even though it meant abandoning the simple life she had built for herself and her daughter. The afternoon had begun with cleaning brass casings from shooting lanes, and had ended with her becoming part of a military operation to expose government treason. As they reached the safe house, Sarah understood that there was no going back to her old life, but perhaps the new path would lead to something more important than she had ever imagined possible.